I'm Ashley All. I am a communications professional in Kansas. I've been doing this work for about 20 years now, which is kind of scary to say out loud. But I have worked in both political spaces, government spaces, policy, nonprofit, et cetera. And in the last couple of years, did some issue campaign work, both in Kansas and across the country. Today we're going to talk about a couple different topics, but I first want to say thank you for coming because I know it's a Friday afternoon and that's a little bit where we all start to turn off for the weekend, but I thank you for coming, and I want to make this as interactive as possible. So as we're going through, if there are things that either I'm saying that you don't follow or that you have more questions about, please speak up. Or if you have questions specific to your organization about something you're planning that you want to do, by all means, workshop it here. That's what we're here for. But first I want to take a minute just to get kind of an idea of what everybody in the room works on. So if you can just, and where you're from. I'm not going to go around to everybody, but if anybody wants to like call out like a topic or an issue or that they work on in their, with their organization, please do. I'm going to kind of scan the crowd. Anybody? Mental health.
Transportation and advocacy.
Great. Transportation. Youth development. Family homelessness. Poverty. Any food, what was that? Trauma. Food insecurity. Anybody do food insecurity work? Okay. So a lot of those topics are things that our organization has done research on related to messaging, but also is here to help kind of moving forward. Just a really short snippet about what we do. We are a fairly new organization. We started a year ago. We're the Kansas Common Sense Fund, and our entire existence is to help you all. Our focus is earned media and communication, technical, editing, all of the different things that a lot of nonprofits need, but don't always have the staff and resources to do. There are organizations, larger organizations like Bert Nash. I know a couple people from my home community that might have communication staff, but then there's also probably people in the room that have one or two staff that do literally everything, which is actually the boat that Lauren and I are in right now in our newer organization. So if you have questions, please ask. If you want cards that, to follow up later, get those after. I'm happy to talk more. All right, let's get going. We'll cover the state of media in Kansas, earned media, the benefits of earned media, all of the different components of earned media and how you make that work for your organization. Also, the importance of relationship building with reporters, some of the different kind of technical aspects of interviews, and then also the importance of values-based messaging, and then some research and messaging recommendations and examples that I'm happy to share with you, and then we can do any questions throughout as well. So please feel free to ask. State of media. As all of you know, media has changed a lot since I started working, actually, in the last 20 years. People are getting information from very divergent topic or different sources. It used to be when I was growing up, my dad would turn on like the, like nightly news or whatever, and it was like Tom Brokaw or whatever. And everybody kind of had a source and had a shared set of facts. And that has changed. People are getting their news from different sources, whether it's online, whether it's on TV. Newspapers are consolidating. Television is consolidating in some ways, owned by big companies. Staff is dwindling. It's a fight for attention. There are so many different ways to get information, and we're all scrolling or distracted by numerous other things. A lot of people get news through digital sources. I don't know if anybody went to the digital presentation yesterday. Anybody? Yeah. That's where people get their news now. In fact, younger generation gets their news and and searches for information on what? TikTok and YouTube. So traditional sources are just declining, and the demographics of the audience makes a huge impact on where your audience might be. So if you're talking to an older group, they might still get their information from newspapers or television. If you're talking to a younger group, they might be on TikTok. And so it really, we'll talk about this a little bit later. I'm talking for another hour after this, so bear with me. But we'll talk about audience and goal and how all of that feeds into how you're communicating, where, and with who. These are going to be slides that you don't really care about right now, but if you want to look at later, it really shows that a lot of these newspapers are owned by the same big group. So if you think about, it used to be when I started that there was, editorial boards in all of these little communities. We would go to Pittsburgh and you really had to meet with the editor because it was like a representative of the community. It's just not the case anymore. We have very few editorial boards in the state. We have very few, a lot of the news that we get, even in some of the bigger newspapers and smaller newspapers, are written nationally, are written by out-of-state news folks. And then the people who are reporting on, say, issues like at the Capitol in Topeka, there's a pretty small group of them as well. So if you want to take a look at this later, same with TV. Really it has consolidated pretty significantly, which makes our job harder in some ways because there are fewer reporters. They have very little bandwidth, and so getting them to pay attention to what we want them to do a story on our issue is challenging. But it also presents some opportunities. That means that they are overworked, and if you provide them with the information and do some of that background work for them, and present them essentially with a package of information, they are more likely to write a story because it's done for them, which again, as somebody, my dad was a newspaper guy. I'm going to skip that one because it's kind of the same thing, but my dad was a newspaper guy, and they had, and we were in kind of a mid-level community, Newton, Kansas at the time, and they had a lot of reporters, and they were able to cover different beats and all those different things. Now that's just not the case, and so if you can present a fully formed kind of pitch, we'll talk about it in a minute, then you can help them do their job. And in turn, yes, that's kind of frustrating to do extra work, but it also helps us because it gets us the story that we really want, as opposed to what they might put together. There are 3 types of media. Most of you probably have versions of all of these. Paid media, which is placements and ads and different things. We won't talk about that much right now. Owned media, which is like your websites, your social media platforms usually, things that you control. Earned media is content that the press or a blog or something that is outside of your your control that is generated through a news organization or a third party. Earned media is a powerful tool in a lot of different ways. It is something that validates our work. It is something that is a source for us to refer back to, and it really does. People still have a lot of trust, and earned media and media sources like newspapers and a lot of TV, especially local, has a lot of trust and credibility with people still. The farther you get away, national news and all of that, people believe less, but local news, people still trust pretty well. So earned media is something that you have to earn. And Lauren and I have spent a long time working in earned media, and people often assume that what you do is you put out a press release or and then it happens. A great story happens. And I wish it were that easy. But unfortunately, it takes a lot of effort. Not only a lot of effort writing these things, writing the press release, putting together and prepping for the media interviews, putting together story pitches. Those all take a lot of work. But then the follow-up and all of that also takes a lot of effort for us just to get a story, one story about our organization. And as I mentioned earlier, because there is the bandwidth for reporters has shrunk so much, it's really hard to do. So think of all the emails that you get in a day. Imagine you're a reporter and you're getting inundated with everybody's news. And so when we do a press release, it's really important that we follow up, that we make the calls afterwards, and then we send it again, and then we call again, and then we harass the reporters. I say that jokingly. I don't want you to harass them. But follow up in all of that is very important. But what's also important, we'll get to a little bit of this later, is relationship building. The same way that when you want to work with a coalition partner, you don't just call them up and say, hey, we're going to do this big project together, right? And you've never built a relationship with them. They're going to be like, who are you? Like, why would I trust you? Same thing with reporters. If you live in a small community, then there's probably like a handful of maybe reporters, or maybe a couple, maybe two, maybe one, that you can talk to and just get coffee or start to build that relationship. Same in bigger communities. If you're working in Kansas City or in Wichita, Lawrence, or some of those, there are quite a few. And some of them have what we call beats, or like different areas of expertise that they focus on. Find out who they are, who those folks are that cover kind of the things that you're interested in. Whether it's there's a criminal justice writer who covers like the courts, but also might cover some public policy issues that are related to things you're working on. So figure out who those are and reach out to them. I mean, they're going to be busy. Try to choose times that are not prime times for them. For example, the legislative session, if you do work around policy, and so do they, that's a really bad time to try to get to know them. But if you, if you can do it in the off season, in the fall, summer, when people are less busy, maybe not this fall because there's a lot going on, but figure out a time that you can meet them and get to know them, because then when you call, they're much more likely to take your call or to pay attention to what you have to say. On earned media, there's a lot of different things you can do, whether it's events, press releases, actually I'll go back, events, press releases, rallies, speeches, story pitches, releases, all of these different things that you can do to get your information in front of reporters. We don't think of it so much when we do events, but making sure that reporters know that you're having an event, that you provide them with the background information about what you're doing at that event, why, what you're trying to lift up when you're doing speeches. All of that is very important. And so the press release or that information might be one piece of a broader puzzle, where you're providing background to a reporter. And when I say background, it's basically just like more information than what you want in a press release, but it gives them context for why they should even cover this event. And I think that is something that is really important and often overlooked. Each story and quote is an opportunity for us to get in front of reporters or in front of the public for free. And that, as working in nonprofit space, is a gift. We don't have a lot of money to spend on paid advertising, and we don't have a lot of money to kind of amplify our voices sometimes. So every opportunity we have to share our message or our mission, what we're working on, is a gift, and we should take it very seriously. And so when we have an interview or when we put together a press release, it's important that we make sure that we're using the most effective message we can every single time. And that means you put it together, and then if you're doing an interview, you write talking points that are your message, and you practice very consistently. Make sure your message is clear and concise, meaning the shorter the better. We have a very short attention span these days, and so explaining a complicated issue, try to do it ahead of time. Find somebody who doesn't know about your issue, write up a little summary and present it to them so that you can start to understand what makes sense to a regular person, because we all work in very specific spaces, and sometimes we kind of adopt different language and jargon, and we don't want to do that. And so we really want to make sure that we're speaking to regular Kansans. Stick to your core message as best you can. Again, be mindful of word choice. Often we work in food insecurity, homelessness, all these different things, and we probably interact with government programs and all these different things that have acronyms, and we kind of, no matter who it is, whether it's nonprofit, whether it's the business community, government, we all kind of default to our common language in our workspace. But the vast majority of people don't obviously work in that space and don't maybe understand the words that you're using. So just be mindful of word choice and tone. Obviously, you can say the same words in a And the tone of voice makes a big difference. So be mindful of that. Be relevant and timely, meaning if there is something, for example, there is, the Annie A. Casey Foundation releases childhood poverty and different stats throughout the year. There are other reports like that. If you do work in that space and you're trying to kind of use that as a hook to tell your story or tell the story of your organization or something that you're working on or lift up the problem of child poverty, then you should do it pretty close to when they announce the information. So like let them write, let the story about that report hit, and then the very next day or very shortly thereafter, follow it up with a press release about that, tying it to that report and talking about how this is important to your community or to your issue. Choose your messenger wisely. Just beware that messengers are important. And as much as CEOs or presidents or executive directors or staff of an organization are often the default messenger, that's not always the best choice, and it's also not the only choice you have. So when you're thinking about your organization, think about all of the different stakeholders, messengers, people that you have, that you serve, that you work with. They can be incredible messengers. And it's often better if somebody is saying nice things about you than you saying nice things about yourself. And then be prepared and practice. I cannot say this more. It is really important to practice. I used to have talking points stuck on my wall in my office that I would practice over and over again and because it was really important that we get the clear message across every single time in every opportunity that we're in front of Kansans, whether that's TV, newspaper, radio, whatever it might be. And as you know, the best communicators in the world practice. I am not the best communicator in the world. But there are a lot of fantastic people who do this for a living, and they practice. Story pitches. The difference between a story pitch, does anybody have any questions so far, though? I just want to stop there because I'm kind of saying a lot of words at you right now.
Sorry. Your influencers note on your slide, and I had actually already written it down. It is something I wanted to ask you about. Just how effective you've seen that be, and what's your best tips and tricks on how to engage with influencers?
So it can be very helpful. It just depends on what your issue is, what the goal is. And so again, we'll talk about this more a little bit later, but you always want to set a communications goal. What is the goal of this press release we're doing? Is it just to check the box and put it out the door because then you can say you did it? Hopefully not. Hopefully there is a reason why you're doing it. So start there, the goal. And then how do we get there? And who do we need to talk to in order to get there? So if our goal is to, get Lauren to eat vegetables, inside joke because she doesn't like vegetables, then we need to figure out, well, who's the best person to, how are we going to do that? What message does she need to hear? Who's the best messenger to tell her? Who does she trust? And then go from there. And so sometimes influencers are a vital part of that conversation. Are they, do they have an audience? Do they connect with the audience we're trying to reach? Do they have some connection to the issue that we're trying to talk about or that we're lifting up? And so I would start there. Now, the way you interact with it, I think in certain communities, where are you located? Wichita. So I think that there are probably some micro-influencers or people who are recognized in the community that might be worth engaging with. There are sometimes elected officials that are, that have a following that might be worth, it's rarer that you get to a place where you're using true big time influencers. It happens occasionally on some issue campaigns I've worked on. But it can be. But again, it all has to start with the goal of your communication, the audience that you're trying to reach, the messenger that's, and go from there. So, yeah. So story pitches are essentially the same kind of principles as press releases, but they can often be done in a way that is a little bit more informal, in the sense that you can go to go to a reporter in your community and give them an exclusive, which always makes reporters feel special. And so they are interested in covering this information, but you have to craft it in a way that has a hook, something that is relevant to them, that is like something interesting or like new that they should look at. So start there and build, again, starting with your goal of your communication, your audience you're trying to reach, how you're going to convey that through the newspaper or whatever the medium is you're using, and build in context. And again, with this, you want to provide quite a lot of information. So there can be information that's on background. I'm going to see if this is the next slide that we have. 1 second. Yes. Okay. Levels of attribution can be used when we do pitches, when we do interviews, in lots of different situations. And it's not something if you don't work with reporters a lot, I would be cautious. Just assume everything is on the record. That's the default. Be careful. But off-the-record conversations, background conversations can be incredibly helpful in shaping a story. So let's just use an example. There's I'm going to be a spokesperson for an organization that's working on a policy related to Medicaid expansion, for example. And a reporter calls me and says, this legislator did something, doesn't want to have a hearing on the bill. What do you think of that? So instead of just going right into Medicaid expansion is really important for the health of Kansans and my message maybe, I might say, can we talk off the record or on background? And I might say information that's that gives them more context for the issue than what they may have already. And that can be very helpful in helping them understand maybe that policymaker has done different things before, or that they voted a different way prior to that. I mean, so all of that information that I can provide on background is something that they can use in the story. If I provide it off the record, they cannot use it in the story. So those are a couple different options, and they can be incredibly helpful. For example, driving over here today, I did an entire interview on background. Now, when they attribute any of that information to me, it'll say spokesperson for, and then that's it. It won't say Ashley All. It'll say spokesperson says blah, blah, blah about this issue. Now, that's really helpful because I can give them a lot more information. On the record is specific quotes. They quote you, they attribute it to you by name, title, all of the things. So when you are on the record, make sure you are clear and concise in your quotes, which is why I distinguish those two things, because there's a whole bunch of information that reporters need to know about an issue that you're working on. But there may be one sentence that they need to hear on the record, and that the public needs to hear on the record. And so think through that. And again, this is what Lauren and I are here for. If there are things like that that you in the future would like to talk through, happy to do it. Does anybody have any questions or examples or comments at that point? Anything they're working on that you would like to discuss? And then we'll move on. Okay. It can just be it can be very helpful. And the other thing that's really fascinating is the way also relationships play into this. If these are reporters that you have worked with a lot, then obviously maybe you don't even have to say you're off the record. Like there are some reporters in the Capitol, I'm certain that just from my previous work and Lauren's previous work, they just know that when we start to banter, it's off the record. And then when we say, okay, now we're on the record, then it's fine. But that is not always the case. And so be very cautious, especially with reporters you've never worked with before, that you clarify those things. And usually what we recommend is if you want to be off the record, then you say to them, can we be off the record first? And they must say back to you, yes. Okay. All right, interviews. There's me doing an interview. Interviews are serious business. Prep for them, do your talking points, put together exactly what you want to have in the story. Again, every time we share our message, it is a gift, and we should prepare accordingly. When we speak to a reporter, you're speaking for your organization. Yes? Oh, yeah.
Thanks. Amy Scrivener with Bike Walk KC. I've been doing this for almost 30 years, and I find that the heads up about an interview, that time is shorter and shorter and shorter. So practicing for perfection is almost non-existent. And so I wonder if you have any tips about if you know that you've put something out there or an event or something that may attract earned media, that you just have a little back in your back pocket, because you don't often have time to prep
Absolutely.
for these.
Yeah. Usually it is, hey, I need a quote for my story now. And then you're like, oh my gosh. But if you are putting something out proactively, then you should do the prep work before that happens. But oftentimes we don't control that. There's something that happens in the community that is related to homelessness, or there's something related to mental health, or all these different topics come up. What I would say is there is probably, if you thought about it, there is probably a specific message that your organization wants to get out there regardless of what the question is. Maybe it's about mental health. Maybe it's about food insecurity. But come up with like a handful of very, very brief message talking points that you can practice. Like, I highly recommend, if you do interviews with any sort of frequency, once a month even, that you build that into your schedule, 30 minutes a week or something, where you practice talking points and practice, even with a partner, doing Q&A back and forth, because it will be, so incredibly helpful for you in the long run, because you'll always be ready and you won't, but it's also how we get over being nervous. So 2.5 years ago, I would die I could not be on TV. I was forced to, and every time I did it, I felt like I was gonna throw up, quite honestly. Like, I don't love public speaking. It's never been a thing that I liked. It's terrifying. But over the course of time, it's like, what's it called? When you have little bits of, where you essentially do it a little bit, and every time it gets easier, and that's how it was. Like, I had no choice, just had to do it. And so eventually you get over it. So now it's still a little bit frightening to stand up here and have all you stare at me, but I'm much better than I used to be. I mean, I used to be really scared. So it's also very helpful in that way. If we practice even, like I said, answering questions, not just talking points, but making, somebody ask you questions about your issue. It can be really helpful to just getting more comfortable saying those words out loud. And then you can do it anytime, and that is a kind of a superpower after a certain point. Good question, thank you. Any other questions while we're paused? Okay. But again, every time you speak, you're speaking for your organization, and so you need to make it count. So practice. Oftentimes, if you have the luxury of time, make a plan. Get all of the interview details. Try to get as much about what they're going to ask you as possible. Talk about, request talking points from your team if it's something that you don't, like if you have a bigger organization, it's something that you're not as familiar with. Maybe get somebody from that area to talk about it, or at least get talking points and help with understanding, and so you know exactly what you're talking about. Anticipate opposition. There may be people in your community that disagree with what you're doing, or that disagree with the issue, or disagree with anything. So think about what they might say about what you're talking, what issue you're talking about, and be ready, or at least think through what a response would be. Because oftentimes a reporter will come to you, and if something happened in your community they want you to comment on, they'll come to you and be like, well, such and such said this. What do you think? And so be prepared to pivot back to what you want to say, but also we can usually come up with what the questions will be if we think about it hard. Make time to practice. Again, mock interviews, talking, back and forth, practice. Consider recording yourself, especially if you're going to do TV. I think in some ways Zoom actually helped me with this, because I have a very expressive face, and sometimes you'd watch yourself on Zoom and be like, oh my gosh, my eyes are crazy. But So videotaping helps because you can see those and you can correct those things. And sometimes we don't even know we're doing something, you know? I mean, I'm sure I'm waving my hands around like dramatically up here. And maybe that's okay, maybe it's not. But understanding those things, there used to be a previous public official, I won't name names, who worked many years ago with my husband, and there was a hand gesture she would do that actually like would hit her bracelet on the podium. And she didn't even, strangely, she didn't hear the noise, but also she just didn't notice it. It just was like, you know, we all have those tics, so correcting them, because they can be distracting when you're trying to convey a message to the public. Make space for your interview. Make sure that you have like a quiet space, that you have planned kind of what's in the background. Look at it because don't be in front of posters or things that are distracting. You know, if you're doing an interview in a space where there's, you know, like at home, since we do them on Zoom now, you know, is your cat going to jump onto your lap or something in the middle? Maybe. I mean, we all saw lots of different examples of bad behavior during the pandemic on interviews. But plan that. But also, you know, and make sure you have a calm environment. But also, like, if you're talking about an issue that is important, and there's like, you know, the environment might speak a lot to what you're talking about. For example, if you're doing an interview about the lack of, I just saw a post about Just Food needing additional contributions for their food pantry. And what did they do? They showed empty shelves. And so if it is important to the context of the story for you to be in the environment or be in like a child care center that, you know, if there's some reason for you to be in that environment that's helpful to tell the story, then do it. But also just beware of distractions because it can be challenging. And if you're going to do an interview, have a you know, like a staff friend or a teammate with you. Oftentimes it's just helpful, for feedback. Lauren watches me and gives me feedback because that's how we get better. And they also are another set of ears to understand, like if you said something that maybe was not a good thing to say, or if the reporter says you said something that you maybe didn't say. So it's always just good to have a second set of ears in the room. Basically the same, like set the background rules. Make sure you try to understand what the questions are, and also do a little research on the reporter if you can. Oftentimes you can tell where they're gonna, like if they have an angle. I know that sounds terrible because they're not supposed to, but sometimes you can look at the stories that they've written. You know, do they cover a specific issue all the time, and what does their coverage look like? And that can be helpful. And so, you know, do a little bit of research. I'm gonna switch sides because I feel like I'm seeing the same guys. Do a little bit of research. Clearly articulate when you're on and off the record. And remember that reporters, even if in small communities, they may be friends of yours. Does anybody have a friend that's a reporter? Yeah, okay. When you are doing an interview, they are not your friend. I have had to remind, you know, high-level public officials of that. I mean, they are not your friend. I mean, you don't have to be mean to them, but like, you want to make sure that you have a job to do, and it is to deliver this message. They have a job to do, report the story, and maybe, you know, ask tough questions. So just be aware of that. Also beware of pauses. Reporters are taught to ask a question, and then when you give your perfect answer, then they just sit there and stare at you. And what do we all do when we have silence? We fill it, and we start talking. And that can be beneficial to them and not beneficial to you. So figure out different ways to repeat your talking points or to answer the question in a different way, or to kind of, you know, or just let them, you know, they're not, usually they don't say, and she paused for a really long time. Unless you're intentionally avoiding a question, then they might, but that's very infrequent. So, but also you can use your pause. Oftentimes if you're doing a TV interview, you're gonna be on for like 3 seconds, 5 seconds. So they're not gonna spend a bunch of time listening to you pause. So if there's a question, take a beat, make sure you're ready to speak, and then answer. You don't have to be the first, you know, very quick. You can take a pause. And also, if you disagree with the premise of a question, reporters often come in, as I said, they have an angle, or they have decided in their minds what the story is, given the information that they have been given thus far. And so they might come in and ask a question that is biased in some way, or leans into frames it in a way that is, maybe in your opinion, inaccurate, or negative towards like your organization or something. Feel free to push back on that, or just to reiterate the question the way you ought to, you think it ought to be asked. Maybe what you're asking is, just like reframe it. I think what you're asking is this. Or you can just say, that's not exactly right. Go ahead.
Do I need a mic?
Oh, yes.
So I have a question. All right, is it on?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
I think so.
So what if reporters want you to answer via email, right? So we get
My dream. Sorry. Go ahead.
So I would say dream, but also can also lose the context of what is the tone, right? Like, because I can read something and I take kind of
For sure.
what their premise is coming at. So if if they're pretty adamant about not doing an in-person interview, I mean, what's kind of I don't know how to, the approaches will still answer the questions, but it can be really
Right.
challenging because then they read our tone and it may feel defensive.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say two things. It is amazing when you can write out your statements often, because you can say exactly what you want, you can edit it, and you can make it perfect. You're right. The struggle there is that how do you provide that background information or context to the situation without giving them like 17 paragraphs that they can then pull from? So I would say if the issue is complicated, you might respond to them and say, I would love to just, can we chat on the phone? I mean, I'm happy to send you a statement, but can we chat on the phone for a minute, just off the record, because I think there's a lot here that I just want to explain. I mean, you don't want to be condescending and be like, I don't think you understand. But if you just ask them to chat, I mean, that's their job. I mean, we don't want to create a situation where we're then making them upset with us. You always want to be as nice as possible. It's very hard sometimes. But asking for them to give a little bit more time to understand the full context of the issue or the story that they're trying to write should be, if they're a good journalist, that should be helpful to them. Now, whether it is or not, and whether they want to do it or not is a different story sometimes, but that's what I would do. I would say, happy to send you a statement, but I'd really, there's a lot to this issue, and I'd love to just maybe talk on background or off the record, just so you understand all the kind of intricacies of it. And then hopefully they'll do that. Not always. But again, I mean, but it helps you give them a much broader picture of what is happening. Because often in lots of issues, whether it's dealing with mental health or dealing with, people try to make it pretty black and white, and it's just not. And nuance is not always an easy thing for reporters or for the public sometimes. And so figuring out how we can layer in some of that context is important. She has a question. Does that help? Is that helpful? Okay.
How about when the reporter asks, do you have a client or someone in the community that I can talk to as follow-up to this interview or question or?
So I am a huge believer in additional messengers. Now that creates work and challenges and uncertainty because I'm pretty sure what I'm going to say is going to be right. But it's like, and so oftentimes I spend a lot of time working with messengers, different people in the community who are going to have a different perspective, because those different perspectives are incredibly important. It's not just me talking about food insecurity in a community. I'm not the only one that cares about it. There's a whole bunch of people, and it's not just advocates that care about it. It's business owners. It's all these different people that add layers, and in this news story, that's powerful, because then all of a sudden it's not just like this one lady saying these things. It's this whole chorus of voices talking about the issue in a way that's helpful to us. So it's very important, and it can be incredibly persuasive. And again, like I said, it's always great when somebody is saying nice things about you or what you're doing or supporting the issue beyond just you and your organization. So if you have people that you think would be good, I would start cultivating those and maybe talk to them about whether they'd be willing to have conversations with reporters. Because oftentimes people need some warming up to that idea. Not everybody loves to talk to reporters. And it takes some time. But I will say, I do a lot with volunteers. We do volunteer prep for folks who are going to talk to reporters on the record. A lot of, you'll see it around campaign season or people going canvassing on issues and different things. Reporters really like to do that. They like to go out into the community and follow canvassers or follow volunteers going door to door and hear what they're talking about, hear what folks at the doors are talking about. But again, it takes some work and some preparation. I will say that oftentimes reporters are far nicer to volunteers and other messengers than they are to the communications director for an organization. Usually they hold, it is my experience that they hold me to a much higher standard. And then when they go out into to talk to a volunteer of ours, they're much nicer. But it's also my job as the communications director, if I'm giving them a volunteer to talk to set those boundaries and say, you need to be very clear when you're recording them or when you're going to be on the record so that they understand, because they don't do this for a living, and usually they are. But again, it's how you feel, whether you think it's a good messenger that helps your cause. You need to think through that.
I think just a tip for people working in nonprofits, if you have board members as part of the recruitment process and you go, okay, that guy knows how to handle himself in front of a camera, or that, this person, whatever, ask up front, say get a catalog, get a Rolodex of folks that would be willing to lend a voice, and ask for that consent, ahead of time, just from practice. That just helps to have your list of people who can speak as third party.
Yep. No, several years ago I worked on an issue campaign, and I would do an interview with reporters, and then I would essentially send them a list. Here are all the people you should call. And, they would call some of them, but it was people that we'd already talked to, people that we'd already prepped, people that, and also diverse voices, because it doesn't help for us to have all the same person talking. We need diverse voices, people who represent different groups of people, different demographics, different age groups, different jobs, all kinds of things. So those are all really good suggestions to look out for. You guys are gonna get these slides, so I'm not gonna go through this. Same basic thing, use your silence, be willing to pause for a minute. So our organization does research, both around how Kansans feel about issues, and also we did some research over the last year around values. The idea was just to get an idea of where are those kind of shared values, and how can we connect with different groups in our community. So we did this research, and it is really helpful especially when we're working on issues that might have, if we're working on a policy related to homelessness, or people can have different opinions of that, and it can get contentious sometimes. So how do you build a message that brings people together around an issue that you care about? So there are quite a few different issues or different values that we found: hard work, family, community. People are very much feeling disconnected. Interestingly, all the things that I said about how people get their information from lots of different sources also feeds into, we all are on our phone all the time, which seems like a choice, but also makes us feel disconnected, if we're as connected as we seem to be. So there's a lot there, especially for organizations that work in community and really focus on connecting community and family and all of those different things. So oftentimes what we suggest is building your message, not starting with like the nitty-gritty policy or the issue that you work on all the time, but starting with a shared value. So, for example, if we are working on food insecurity, I work for the food bank in whatever town, in Topeka. I can talk about how, when I was growing up, people could work, we worked hard and we were able to put food on the table. But now things cost so much, it's really challenging. Even some of the people who, in our community that work the hardest are struggling, and we need to do more. And then you go, and so that's like something that I think most of you guys probably would support, and probably a pretty broad swath of people would support. They understand that working hard, you should be able to put food on the table, but it's really hard right now. And so then you ladder up to your either issue or message, and that's why we need to, do a community event to get more food for the Just Foods, or we need to expand access to, SNAP, or whatever it might be. You can then ladder up to it. There are lots of other issues. We worked on Medicaid expansion. Again, it's like we all want to live healthy lives and have access to affordable health care. But it's a struggle right now, and even some people who work really hard are struggling to get by, and they don't have access to care now. That's why it's important for us to expand Medicaid and make sure that everyone, regardless if they're struggling right now, has access to affordable health care and can get back on their feet. So you broaden the support with your shared value statement, and then you go up to the top of the pyramid. And again, you can use emotion. Sometimes emotion and stories are important. You could talk to somebody who's been impacted by the lack of Medicaid expansion, for example. We did a huge project on Medicaid expansion. This is why it's like fresh in my mind. But you can use emotion, the right appropriate amount of emotion to get people to feel, the appropriate language that is clear and concise and that resonates with your audience, and then the message, and then your policy. Some examples of that I just gave, Medicaid expansion, again. And I say remove partisanship. I know you all are C3s and you're not partisan, but I'm talking more kind of like about dividing, like division. And so it's more just about bringing everybody together. We all are affected by tough times. It doesn't matter who you are or where you live. We all struggle sometimes. These slides will be shared with you, just so you know. You can take as many pictures if you want, but they'll be shared too. But it really does. We start at the beginning. We define the problem. We state our position, and then we, again, talk about how this impacts everyone. Childcare. How many people in here work on childcare issues? Great. Very important. And I would say one of the most universally, we did research on a bunch of different issues, and childcare was like the top issue. Everyone, no matter who you are, what age you are, didn't matter if you had kids or not, everybody knew it was a problem, and everybody knew that it was something we needed to deal with. And so, again, we all work hard so we can do what we can for our family and keep our kids safe, but it costs too much, even for some of the hardest working parents I know. Can't afford childcare. That's why we need to make childcare more affordable, et cetera, et cetera. Doesn't matter who you are, where you live, we all struggle to find affordable childcare. So you can see how it's a stronger message. Now, you're not always going to have this much time to get a message across. Some of, like I said earlier, concise matters. But if you're doing something where you're able to have more of a conversation with somebody about the issue, policymaker or community member, community leader, building it this way and finding a place of shared experience, shared value, a commonality to start with that you can get them to agree with you on, and then building from there is always a much better strategy and more effective. Food insecurity, I just kind of did that one. I'm going to pause there. We have 15 minutes. Well, I don't actually know. Am I supposed to go all the way to 3? Okay. We're going to have questions if anybody has any. Or, yes?
I had a quick question, and it was just regarding when we have clients who are going to be interviewed or the possibility is there, do you have any advice on how to prep them to kind of conduct themselves in the interview process? I know you kind of alluded to it before, but
Yeah, so, I mean, can you give me a little bit more information?
yeah,
Like what,
particularly younger kiddos, because I've noticed like when they are asked certain questions by reporters, they phrase it in a way that's not conducive for them to answer the most clear way.
Yeah.
And some of our kids have
Yeah.
problems communicating sometimes, and so it takes them a few tries to rephrase the question and
yeah,
reframe it.
for sure. Yeah, I mean, I think that the first thing you should do is whoever it's going to be, you should sit down with them and explain what's going to happen. Because most of us don't do interviews with reporters. Most normal people don't do reporter interviews all the time. And so it's just kind of weird, like this person's sitting there, they're looking at you. I mean, it's just like in a weird environment. And so explain to them what's going to happen, like especially somebody like young. Talk about, they're gonna ask you questions. If you need to take a second, you can. I mean, hopefully a reporter is going to be very forgiving of a small person. So kind of give them all that context, and then whatever the issue that you're talking about or what the interview is about, you should prepare questions ahead of time. And you should be like, now I'm gonna ask you some questions. I just want you to give me what your answer is back, and just do that kind of back and forth. It's a little hard with some, if it's a kid, to do talking points, for example. But just getting them to say it over and over again, or repeat it back, and go through that process with them ahead of time, I think is really helpful. I mean, it's helpful for us, even if we don't use talking points. Like the first time I say something is garbage, and then the second time it's better, and then it gets better every time. So I would definitely do that, and I would, as much as you can, do it days in advance. Give as much time before that interview as you can to help them get comfortable, because it is scary sometimes. Even for grown-ups, it's scary. And so preparing that environment, making sure they're in a safe and familiar environment. Don't take them to a TV station, unless there's some real good reason for it. Don't put them in an environment that's scary, that then also makes you feel, and then practice it. Like if you're going to do an interview, at a childcare center or at a youth, I don't know what they're called these days, but at the Boys and Girls Club in Lawrence, they have a career center or something. If you're going to do an interview there, then put them in the environment and try to recreate it as best you can, because then, hey, it's we're just doing this again. We just did it twice yesterday. It's all familiar and they feel comfortable. So that's the best I would.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely.
So earned media, and just what would you do after? I know I have a friend who's a reporter at a local, just a small newspaper, and he has a file of thank you notes. He appreciates those thank you notes. What is the protocol if you have various levels of media exposure, interviews, things like that? I don't know what's typical.
So I think it varies. Depends on what you do. I mean, Lauren's, do you send thank you notes? Okay. Well, so it's different. I mean, I think that we deal with so many reporters that it's a little bit difficult to do thank you notes. However, if it is a unique situation, or if it's a small community or something, then absolutely, send them a note and say thanks for. I mean, I always do a follow-up. I usually do a follow-up email or something. I don't do so many hard note paper notes these days, but I'll follow up and say thanks for chatting. Here's some more, I'll give them more information or something. So I think that that's very helpful, however you feel comfortable doing that. Yeah, I mean, I do, but it's all about building the relationship. And so however you do that in you don't want to be overbearing, but you definitely want to, reach out to them multiple times. Especially if you send out a release, I've seen it, and we probably all do it, and occasionally I do it, but it's you send out a release and you're just well, I did it, and that's all you do. And so, if you have the luxury of working for the governor, which both Lauren and I did at one point, or if it's a big issue that's really, got a lot of heat around it, people are really paying attention, then maybe you don't have to do anything else. But oftentimes in nonprofit spaces, you have to work your tail off to get attention. And so that means calling the reporter and saying, I'm going to send you this press release, and it says this, and then sending the press release, and then following up the next day and being like, did you get my press release? And then you follow up again. I mean, it's a lot of legwork, and that's challenging. And then if they do write a story, comment on it. Be like, hopefully it's a great story and everything turned out perfectly. But say, I saw your story, and that, thank you. Thank you for covering this issue. It's really important to the community. Another thing that I find incredibly helpful, if you are going to, and I mentioned this earlier, if you're going to do an interview with a particular reporter, look at what they've written before. And when you call, if you're trying to get them to cover something that you're doing, be like, I saw your story about blah, blah, blah. They're like, oh my gosh, that person read my story. And that actually, we all like to feel like somebody actually looked at our things. And so, you can do that in any situation. Tell the person, I saw your blog post about, increasing food access in Wyandotte County, or whatever it might be. And people are going to be like, oh, that person paid attention to what I do and cares. And so I think there's a lot of things you can do like that with reporters, and also with just your personal interactions with other partners that can be really beneficial. Yeah.
I think you kind of just answered it. I was going to ask, just if you are in a bigger market, how do you foster those relationships or even start those relationships? Like, I sent out 150 press releases, and got one reply. Mm-hmm. So before I even get to that step, how do I build connections with the media community?
Where are you located?
Wichita.
Wichita, okay. So I would probably go through, in Wichita, I would go through and figure out what issue, or what's your organization? Okay. So I would probably go through and figure out, are there reporters that have covered that, the Wichita Eagle, or at some of the TV stations or the radio stations, see if there are people who have been paying attention. And then directly reach out to them, not asking for anything, not in the context of you need to write this story, but just say, I do a lot of work on this issue. I see that you have written all these, written these stories about the foster care system. I would love to just get coffee if you have time. Again, choose a time that's not like prime time for them. And then, and they may not, and that's okay, but at least you're trying. But we did a class like this in the spring, and one of our participants who works at the Neighboring Movement in Wichita did exactly that. She reached out, and the reporter was like, sure. It's like somebody from the Business Journal or something. They're like, yeah, sure, that's great. Let's get coffee. And they went, and she was able to kind of have a couple interactions with that reporter, and then pitch a story. So it's not always going to work. We're all busy, and so sometimes it doesn't. But just asking and figuring out who are the best options for in your market, because like you said, they get like a bajillion press releases, and it's not because they're mad at you or that you didn't do a good job. That's what I always take it very personally. But it's not that. It's just they're overwhelmed. And so anything that you can do to kind of put your name or your face or in front of them multiple times so that they remember is valuable. One more?
I really appreciate the information that you have shared and your mission. I'm looking at your website. But what I'm not finding and I'm curious about is a little bit more about how you're funded as a nonprofit. It's not on here.
Okay. So we have raised money. We get funding probably a lot of the same ways you all get funding. We have some foundation funding, both in-state and national. And our goal really is to make it so that we are a resource and not funded by all you. But at the same time, there's a limit to that. And so we are always looking for different ways we can be helpful. If we're going to do significant work with you, there probably might need to be like a contract and different things. But a lot of it really is fundraising that we go out and do with foundations, other community organizations, other philanthropy entities. So it's pretty much the same way as you all, which has been a learning experience because I didn't do that stuff before.
Great. Thank you. And thank you to our speaker, Ashley.
Thanks for coming.
Applause.